The anomaly in the void, the chill was a constant companion here. A silent, pervasive presence that seeped into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. 3 months of darkness had just begun at the Antarctic research base, and the sun was a memory, a distant, golden dream. Outside, the wind howled, a banshee wail against the reinforced walls, carrying with it the fine, needle-like ice crystals that scoured the landscape. I ran a gloved hand over my stubbled chin, the rough fabric scratching faintly. My eyes, perpetually tired, were fixed on the panoramic display that stretched across the main console. It showed not the familiar constellations of home, but the raw, unadulterated tapestry of the cosmic microwave background, the faint echo of creation. Tonight, I was sifting through the latest data package. A flood of information streamed from the array's primary sensor. My routine was meticulous, almost ritualistic. I checked for calibration drift, filtered out known cosmic noise, cross-referenced with previous observations. It was a tedious process, but one that demanded absolute focus. A single anomaly, a tiny blip, could be a breakthrough, or more often a glitch. Hours blurred into a seamless continuum of glowing screens and the rhythmic click of keys. The air in the observation dome was dry, recycled, tasting faintly metallic. My fingers, stiff despite the heated gloves, danced across the interface, zooming, panning, isolating regions of interest. It was a place where physicists expected precisely nothing. And for years, that's exactly what we'd found. Glorious, predictable nothing. Then it appeared. A spike. Small, almost negligible, buried deep within the noise floor. My first thought was a momentary power fluctuation, perhaps a micrometeorite impact on one of the outer antennae. Happens all the time. I flagged it for system diagnostics, a routine procedure. But a stubborn prickle of unease, like static electricity on my skin, made me hesitate. I isolated the signal, bringing its waveform into sharper focus on a secondary monitor. It wasn't a clean, sharp burst, nor the chaotic white noise of cosmic interference. Instead, it was intricate, a sequence of modulations, subtle fluctuations in amplitude and frequency that didn't repeat. Not a simple pulse, not a gravitational wave signature, not the predictable chirp of a pulsar. It was complex, almost layered, like a melody played on an instrument I'd never heard, in a scale I didn't recognize. My breath hitched, a shallow intake of the dry, cold air. I leaned closer to the screen, my reflection staring back at me, a gaunt face illuminated by the data, eyes wide with a dawning, unwelcome curiosity. This wasn't random, and it was coming from a region that, according to every single survey ever conducted, was utterly, profoundly empty. Just the vast, silent gulf. My scientific training screamed at me, discard it, it's an error, a phantom. The observatory, for all its sophistication, was still a machine, prone to human and mechanical failings. I could rerun the filters, adjust the parameters, and it would vanish, swallowed by the statistical averages. But the image of that waveform, its impossibly intricate pattern, had already etched itself into my mind. It was a whisper in the silence, an impossible pattern against the backdrop of cosmic oblivion. My heart began a slow, heavy thrum against my ribs, not from fear, not yet, but from a growing sense of profound disorientation. This was a violation of expectation, a defiance of the fundamental laws of observation. It shouldn't be, yet there it was. A persistent, non-repeating sequence, originating from nothing. My hands, still hovering over the console, felt clumsy, alien. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. What was I looking at? A phenomenon that had no precedent, no explanation. A signal that spoke of an intelligence, or at least a complexity, that simply shouldn't exist in that desolate corner of the universe. I appended a note, a brief, detached summary of its unique, non-repeating waveform. I told myself it was for future cross-referencing, a point of data to be dismissed later, when a more rational explanation presented itself. But as I typed, my fingers felt heavy, and a tremor, subtle but insistent, ran through my arm. Watchful. What had I just opened myself to? The chill was a constant companion here, a silent, pervasive presence that seeped into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. Outside, the wind howled, a banshee wail against the reinforced walls, but inside my lab, the only sound was the low thrum of the servers and the rhythmic click-whir of the cooling fans. I hadn't seen the dawn in days, not truly, just the artificial glow of screens reflecting in the thick lenses of my glasses. My focus, singular and absolute, was on the signal. It pulsed across the main monitor, a shimmering cascade of data points rendered in impassable hues of violet and deep emerald. What I'd initially dismissed as a glitch, a bizarre cosmic artifact, was now demanding my full, unyielding attention. It wasn't random, not in the way background radiation or even a supernova remnant would be. There was a structure here, a hidden syntax within the chaotic beauty. My fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up spectrographs, frequency analyzers, pattern recognition algorithms. Each new filter I applied, each statistical test I ran, only deepened the enigma. The signal's complexity was staggering. I'd worked with pulsar emissions, the intricate dance of black hole mergers, the faint echoes of the Big Bang itself. All of them, even at their most convoluted, eventually yielded to established physics, to the predictable laws of the universe. This was different. The energy signature was infinitesimal, barely registering above the background noise. Yet its internal organization suggested a power source beyond any known stellar process. It wasn't a burst, not a continuous wave, but something in between, a series of discrete, incredibly brief pulses, each one packed with information, overlapping and interweaving in a way that defied conventional Fourier transforms. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen for a moment. My eyes, gritty from lack of sleep, traced the fractal-like repetitions, the subtle modulations. It was like looking at a microscopic image of a rainforest, seeing patterns within patterns, an entire ecosystem thriving within a space that should have been empty. I'd spent 2 weeks now, barely leaving the lab, subsisting on nutrient paste and the occasional stale biscuit. The other researchers, the geophysicist, the meteorologist, even the lead technician, they tried to draw me out. A shared meal, a game of chess in the common room. I'd politely declined, citing urgent work, the need for uninterrupted concentration. The truth was, I couldn't tear myself away. This signal was a hook sunk deep. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the signal's pattern caught my attention. It wasn't a random fluctuation. It was a response. I had, hours ago, programmed a simple, repeating sequence of prime numbers into a low-power, wideband emitter, a kind of cosmic hello world, just a thought experiment. It was a long shot, a gesture of scientific whimsy, and now the signal had subtly altered, not mimicking my input, but integrating it, shifting its own internal rhythm in a way that acknowledged my probe. My spine stiffened. It wasn't just complex, it was intelligent. My breath hitched. My fingers, usually so precise, trembled as I isolated the segment. The pattern wasn't just non-random, it was non-terrestrial in its logic, yet undeniably structured. It wasn't a language I could parse, not like a radio transmission or a coded message. It was something deeper, more fundamental, like the underlying mathematics of the universe itself, but arranged with a clear, deliberate intent. This signal wasn't from a dying star or a distant galaxy, a place that, by all known laws, should have been utterly silent, and it was responding to me. My hands, clammy, gripped the edge of the console. The hum of the machines seemed to intensify, vibrating through the floor up into my bones. My eyes darted around the lab at the familiar equipment, the blinking lights, the schematics taped to the wall. Everything suddenly felt alien, fragile. A knock at the reinforced door made me jump. "Raj, you in there? Dinner's ready, hot stew tonight." It was the lead technician, his voice muffled but clear. "Not hungry," I called back, my voice hoarse, barely recognizable. "Still working through some data." A pause. "Should take a break, mate. You've been at it for days." "I'm fine, just need a bit more time." I heard the technician sigh, then footsteps receding. I didn't regret it. The stew could wait. Sleep could wait. Everything else could wait. This was the most important thing I had ever encountered, perhaps the most important thing humanity had ever encountered. My initial review was complete. The signal was a conscious presence. It defied all known forms of communication or energy. Yet it was undeniably there, undeniably aware. My scientific curiosity had warped into something else, a desperate need to understand, to unravel this impossible thread. I felt a growing sense of isolation, a chasm opening between me and the mundane concerns of my colleagues. They were worried about the pipes freezing, about resupply drops, about the next shift change. What was it trying to say? More terrifyingly, what was it learning from me? The perpetual night had settled in, a heavy, velvet blanket over the Antarctic research base, swallowing the horizon whole. 3 months of darkness had begun, a vast, unbroken stretch of black that pressed against the reinforced windows of my lab. It was a perfect mirror for the void I was now staring into day and night through the array's filters. The isolation here, once a comfort, was beginning to feel like a cage, albeit one I had willingly entered. I'd been running the analysis for what felt like an eternity, losing track of the hours, the days. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, not when the signal pulsed with such impossible complexity. My colleagues, the station manager, the geological specialist, the handful of technicians, they left me alone now. They understood, or at least they'd stopped trying to pull me away. My eyes burned, gritty and dry, but I couldn't tear them from the primary display. The patterns shifted, evolved a fractal dance of information that defied every known principle of communication. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, and it was ancient beyond comprehension. The first hint of something amiss wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, a flickering. The primary display, usually a steady blue glow, pulsed once, a faint green ripple across its surface. I blinked, attributing it to fatigue. Then it did it again, a beat later, quicker this time. The data stream on the secondary monitor, a dense cascade of numbers, briefly stuttered, freezing for a fraction of a second before resuming its relentless descent. I frowned, rubbing my temples. The equipment here was robust, designed for extreme conditions. Such glitches were rare. A low thrum resonated through the floor beneath my worn boots, the constant, reassuring hum of the base's generators. It was a sound I'd grown so accustomed to, it had become invisible, like the air I breathed, but now it seemed to shift. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor, like an off-kilter heartbeat, began to weave itself into the steady bassline. It was a dissonance, a subtle wavering that scratched at the edges of my hearing. I turned my head, straining, trying to pinpoint the source. Was it just the wind outside, funneling through a vent? The bass groaned sometimes, settling in the ice. But this felt different. It felt internal. I leaned closer to the monitor, ignoring the growing unease. The signal was demanding my full attention. It was revealing new layers, new permutations. I typed furiously, adjusting parameters, trying to find a Rosetta Stone within its alien syntax. Wrong, slimy. I snatched my hand back, staring at my fingertips, then at the keyboard. Nothing. My imagination, I told myself, just my overactive mind playing tricks. But the tricks continued. It darted between two towering stacks of hardware, disappearing before I could fully register it. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again slowly. The lab was still. The lights were steady. The air was frigid and still. The thrumming, however, persisted, growing more pronounced. A low, guttural vibration that now felt less like machinery and more like a distant, sustained groan. It wasn't coming from the generators. My teeth began to ache, a dull throb that pulsed in time with the unsettling hum. I needed a distraction, something to ground myself. My research into the signal had taken me down increasingly obscure rabbit holes. I'd started cross-referencing astronomical data with historical accounts of unexplained phenomena. The base, despite its remote location, possessed a surprisingly extensive digital archive, a relic from previous, more ambitious research agendas. Not academic papers, but scanned copies of brittle, yellowed manuscripts. These weren't scientific observations. These were fevered ravings, the desperate attempts of ancient minds to grapple with something incomprehensible. Yet the language, the themes, the very sense of it, a loud crack suddenly split the air, making me jump. A heavy glass beaker, sitting innocently on a shelf across the room, had spontaneously shattered, sending shards scattering across the floor. There was no one else in the room, no vibrations, no logical explanation. My heart hammered against my ribs. The humming intensified, a low, resonant growl that vibrated through my bones. I stared at the broken glass, then back at the monitor, where the signal continued its silent, intricate dance. The text spoke of reality fraying, of minds unmaking. Was I seeing the first threads unraveling? Was the signal, this impossible presence, reaching out, touching the physical world, or was it merely touching me? And if it was touching me, what else was it capable of touching? The ancient texts, transferred from decaying vellum into stark digital lines, had burrowed under my skin. The images, crude, yet unsettlingly precise depictions of impossible angles and cyclopean structures, pulsed behind my eyelids even after I'd forced myself away from the screen. The air in my small quarters within the Antarctic research base 3 months of darkness beginning, felt heavy, thick, with the weight of unseen things. My fingers trembled as I reached for the lukewarm mug of tea, the ceramic cool against my clammy palm. These were fevered ravings, the desperate attempts of ancient minds to articulate something that shattered their sanity, and now I was listening to the very source of their terror. I was in a space that wasn't a space. It felt like an endless volume, devoid of stars or galaxies, yet not empty. Within it, colossal structures of an obsidian hue shifted, not with movement, but with a terrifying, slow reconfiguration of their very geometry. They weren't solid, they weren't liquid. They were ideas made manifest, folding in on themselves in impossible ways, their surfaces reflecting no light, absorbing everything, even the concept of vision itself. A sound, or perhaps a pressure wave that mimicked sound, resonated through me. It was a frequency too low for human ears, a rumble that vibrated in my bones, in the marrow, in the very core of my being. It spoke of scale, of an ancientness that made the age of stars seem like a fleeting breath. My lungs tightened. I couldn't breathe in this non-place. There was no air, no need for it, yet my body screamed for oxygen, a primal, useless demand. Then a flicker. It wasn't a living creature as I understood it, but a vast, conscious presence. It had no discernible form, no eyes, no limbs, yet I felt its gaze, a scrutiny that peeled back layers of my mind, exposing raw thought and memory. It was not malevolent, not benevolent. It simply was, and the sheer, indifferent being of it was more terrifying than any monster. My own existence, my entire understanding of the cosmos, felt like a single, insignificant dust mote caught in the wake of an unseen current. I bolted upright in my bunk, a gasp tearing from my throat. The sudden return to the familiar four walls of my room. The hum of the base's life support, the faint scent of ozone from the equipment racks. It was jarring, almost painful. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, and my sheets were tangled around my legs. The memory of the dream was so vivid, the tactile sensation of that non-sound still buzzing in my skull. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to push the images away. Just a dream. I told myself, stress, isolation, the perpetual night. This place could play tricks on the mind, but the conviction felt thin, brittle. The structures grew more defined, their non-Euclidean angles carving themselves deeper into my memory. The presence, too, became clearer, though still formless. It began to communicate, not with words, but with an influx of raw data, abstract concepts that bypassed language entirely. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose, my mind struggling to process the sheer volume of information, fragments of an alien cosmology that contradicted everything I knew. I saw, or rather perceived, vast cosmic currents of unknown energy, threads connecting realities, and the terrifying implication that our universe was merely a single, fragile bubble in an infinite, incomprehensible froth. My hands began to shake even when I wasn't dreaming. Holding a pen, stirring my coffee. Adjusting a dial on the spectrometer, a faint tremor ran through my fingers. My focus, once razor-sharp, was now fractured. I felt a constant low thrum beneath my feet, a vibration that no seismic sensor registered, but which my own body seemed to perceive. Was it the base, the earth, or something else resonating from within me? One afternoon, while reviewing a particularly dense block of spectral data, the lines on the monitor seemed to waver. Not a glitch, not a flicker, but a subtle shift in their very structure, as if the pixels themselves were rearranging into a pattern that defied the screen's grid. A momentary distortion, like heat haze, shimmered at the edge of my vision. It was gone in an instant, leaving me blinking, my breath catching in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The data was normal. The screen was steady, but the faint, metallic taste of fear was sharp on my tongue. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat. I stood up too quickly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My head swam. I gripped the edge of my desk, gripped tight. This wasn't just sleep deprivation anymore. This wasn't stress. This was something external, something invasive. It was sending itself. It was manifesting not just in my dreams, but in the fragile reality of my waking world. A colleague, the lead geophysicist, poked his head into my lab. "Raj, you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Her voice, usually warm, sounded distant, muffled, as if filtered through water. I forced a smile, a brittle mask. "Just a long night, too much coffee, I think." The lie felt like ash in my mouth. I wanted to tell her to scream about the shifting geometries, the vast, indifferent presence, the way the world was subtly, terrifyingly unraveling around me. But the words wouldn't form. How could I explain what I was experiencing without sounding utterly mad? She nodded, her expression still tinged with concern. Well, don't overdo it. We still need you in one piece. She withdrew, leaving me alone again in the humming quiet. I stared at the closed door, then back at the spectral data on my screen. The lines were normal. Everything was normal. But the metallic tang in my mouth persisted, and the faint, low hum resonated not just in my bones, but in the very air around me. The distinction was blurring. Was I still in my lab? The air in my small bunk at the Antarctic research base, 3 months of darkness beginning, felt thick, heavy with the phantom scent of old parchment and something else, something metallic and cold, like the very void itself. My colleagues, for the most part, were concerned with the dwindling fresh produce and the impending months of total night. I, however, was consumed. The signal hadn't ceased its insidious whispers. It had grown, not louder, but deeper, resonating with a frequency that felt less like sound and more like a fundamental vibration within my own bones. I saw its patterns in the condensation frosting the windows, in the flickering emergency lights that occasionally pulsed down the long, sterile corridors. I knew I had to present my findings, not just the raw data, which was undeniable, but my interpretations, the terrifying implications. The next morning, or what passed for morning in the perpetual twilight of the base, I brought my analysis to the main common area. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a pallid glow on the faces of the researchers gathered for their daily briefing. The lead researcher, a woman with sharp eyes and a perpetually skeptical brow, nodded for me to begin. My voice, when I started, felt alien, strained. I spoke of the signal's impossible age, its non-Euclidean origin, the way it defied every known law of physics. I projected the spectral analysis onto the main screen, the jagged peaks and valleys stark against the white. Then I overlaid the patterns, the geometric sequences I'd extracted, the ones that correlated with the ancient images. I pointed, my finger trembling slightly, to the recursive structures, the impossible symmetries. This isn't just an anomaly, I insisted, my voice rising. It's a presence, a conscious entity, communicating through the very fabric of space-time, twisting it. I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tightening of shoulders, the averted gazes. A junior analyst cleared his throat, shuffling his feet. Raj, the lead researcher, interjected, his tone carefully modulated. Your enthusiasm is noted, but these are extraordinary claims. We've all seen the initial data. It's perplexing, yes, but to leap to conscious entities and space-time twisting based on what appears to be a highly subjective interpretation of noise and old drawings. Her voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken accusation hanging in the frigid air. I tried to argue, to explain the feeling of it, the way the signal resonated with the ancient texts, but my words tumbled out, disjointed and frantic. My hands gesticulated wildly. I laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. Tricks, or revelations you're too afraid to acknowledge. The lead researcher's expression hardened. That's enough, Raj. We'll revisit this when you've had some rest. For now, please stick to the standard protocols for signal analysis. The dismissal was absolute. I gathered my notes, my hands fumbling, the papers rustling like dry leaves. As I left, I could feel their eyes on my back, not with curiosity, but with a mixture of concern and thinly veiled scorn. The hum of the bass, once a comforting drone, now felt like a low, mocking chuckle. Over the next few days, the isolation deepened. Conversations ceased when I approached. My questions were met with polite, brief answers or simply ignored. The lead researcher assigned me to mundane tasks, logging atmospheric data, calibrating sensors, anything to keep me away from my primary research. The message was clear. My work, my obsession was no longer welcome, but the signal didn't care about their skepticism. It continued its slow, resonant thrum, and the ancient texts, those digital ghosts of forgotten knowledge, still called to me. I retreated to my private terminal in my bunk, pulling the heavy, sound-dampening door shut. I had copies of the texts, of course, saved and encrypted, hidden deep within my personal drives. I opened them again, letting the strange symbols and crude illustrations wash over me. The figures depicted were unsettling, beings of impossible scale, their forms shifting, their outlines defying Euclidean geometry. They were not alien in the conventional sense, but something far older, far more fundamental, like concepts given flesh. I started cross-referencing, drawing connections between the signal's complex wave patterns and the geometric motifs in the texts. A specific waveform, one that pulsed with an almost predatory rhythm, mirrored a symbol for the great eye that watches from beyond. A sequence of shifting frequencies aligned with descriptions of the slumbering hunger that dreams the cosmos into being. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my mind a blur of data and lore, of scientific notation and archaic warnings. The more I delved, the more the two disparate worlds, cutting-edge astrophysics and forgotten myth, began to merge, to coalesce into a single terrifying truth. The texts weren't just folklore, they were a distorted, primitive attempt to describe something utterly incomprehensible, something that had existed long before humanity, perhaps even before the stars. Those who listen too closely shall perceive the true architecture of things, and in that seeing shall be undone. My breath hitched, 3 months of it, and I had listened too closely. Was I being undone? Or was I merely seeing what had always been there, hidden in plain sight? What if the signal wasn't just communicating, but revealing? And what if the knowledge it imparted was not meant for human minds? The Antarctic research base, 3 months of darkness beginning, had become less a sanctuary and more a tomb of my own making. The perpetual night outside pressed against the viewport, an ink-black wall that swallowed the stars I once loved. My breath still hitched sometimes, just like that night, that moment of realization. The darkness had descended, and what if the knowledge it imparted wasn't meant for human minds? The questions gnawed at me, relentless in the echoing quiet of the station. I pushed those thoughts down, or tried to. There was work to be done. A compulsion, really. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the automated hum of the base's life support and the increasing strain in my eyes. The few other researchers here, specialists in glaciology or atmospheric physics, had long since given up trying to engage me. They'd leave trays of untouched food outside my lab door, a silent acknowledgement of my self-imposed exile. I barely noticed them. My focus was absolute, honed to a razor's edge by the constant, subtle thrum of the signal in my mind. My workstation was a chaotic sprawl of monitors, cables, and discarded data printouts. The air was thick with the metallic tang of ozone from the overworked processors and the faint, sweet scent of stale coffee. It wasn't a language in any terrestrial sense. No repeating phonemes, no grammatical structures I could identify. It was something else entirely. A direct data stream, perhaps. A pure, unfiltered download of information. My fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, tweaking parameters, adjusting filters. The raw data scrolled across the main display, a dizzying cascade of abstract symbols and energetic spikes. I felt like a blind man trying to read Braille through heavy gloves. But then a flicker, a resonance, not in the data itself, but in me. A sudden, undeniable intuition, like a memory surfacing from a forgotten dream. I paused, my hand hovering, my breath held. It wasn't a logical step, but a felt one. I input a new set of values, guided by nothing but that strange, internal pull. The screen flickered. Then resolved, a new pattern emerged, stark and undeniable. It wasn't a word. It wasn't an image. It was a concept, pure and unadulterated. Not just astronomical scale, which I understood intellectually, but a scale that dwarfed even galaxies, that rendered the entire observable universe a mere dust motes. My stomach clenched. It was like being shown the true size of the ocean by being submerged, utterly, in its crushing depths. I kept working, driven by an urgency that wasn't entirely my own. It was insidious, this influence, blurring the lines between my thought and its directive. I didn't care. I needed to know. The concepts began to cascade, each one building on the last, each more profoundly unsettling. The second concept downloaded was time, not the linear progression we understand, but an immeasurable, non-sequential flow. Eons folded upon eons, and in that vastness, the lifespan of a star, of a galaxy, was less than a breath. Humanity, our history, our future, was an unregisterable flicker, a cosmic hiccup. My hands trembled slightly as I typed, my vision blurring at the edges. Then came the third. This one hit me like a physical blow. It was the concept of existence. Not just our existence, but the existence of everything we perceive as real. It conveyed that our universe, our entire reality, was not fundamental. It was a thin, fragile membrane stretched over something else, something vast and ancient and utterly, horrifyingly indifferent. A dream, perhaps, or a shadow cast by entities whose true forms and intentions were utterly beyond human comprehension. My breath caught in my throat. My chest tightened, a vise clamping down on my lungs. I pushed back from the console, stumbling back into the cramped living space of my lab. The sudden movement sent a jolt through my exhausted body. My head spun. The bland, sterile walls of the research base seemed to waver, the fluorescent lights buzzing with an unfamiliar menace. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to dislodge the terrifying images that had been burned into my mind, not images, but truths, undeniable and absolute. When I opened my eyes, the world seemed subtly wrong. The hum of the bass, once a comforting background noise, now sounded like a low, guttural growl. I could almost feel the vast, ancient indifference pressing in from beyond the fragile membrane of our reality. The signal wasn't just communicating, it was unmaking. It was peeling back the layers of comforting illusion we'd built around ourselves, revealing the raw, horrifying truth of what lay beneath. We were not masters of our destiny. We were not even significant. We were motes of dust, dancing on a stage that was not our own, unaware of the colossal, slumbering entities that watched, or perhaps simply tolerated, our fleeting existence. It was filled with things that defied every principle of physics, every concept of life, every notion of sanity, and they were waking. My hands, still shaking, reached for the console again. There was more, so much more. The signal pulsed, a steady, insistent beat in the core of my being. It was an invitation, a command. I was terrified, yes, but also undeniably drawn. What further horrors awaited in the depths of its broadcast? What unspeakable truths would it force me to confront? And if I continued to listen, if I continued to let it unravel the fabric of my understanding, what would be left of me when it was done? My breath still hitched sometimes, just like that night, the one that had burned itself into the fragile glass of my memory. 3 months of perpetual night had begun outside the Antarctic research base, and with it, a darkness far deeper had settled within me. The viewport, once a window to the cosmos, now felt like a thick, impenetrable shield against a truth too vast to comprehend. I'd stopped looking out. The stars, those pinpricks of light I'd devoted my life to, felt like a cruel joke now. My reflection in the terminal screen was a stranger. Skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, eyes sunk deep into hollows, rimmed with a perpetual bruise-like purple. Sleep had become a myth, a vague memory of a time before the signal had fully unfurled itself within my mind. My body, once fueled by lukewarm coffee and the thrill of discovery, now ran on a nervous hum, a constant tremor just beneath the skin. I remembered the early days here, the camaraderie with the other researchers, the shared jokes over tasteless rations. Now, their voices were distant echoes. Their concerns about equipment malfunctions or dwindling supplies felt like the babbling of children. My colleagues would sometimes try to engage me, their expressions a mixture of concern and growing wariness. Raj, the chief scientist, had said just yesterday, his voice low, "I need to rest." What could I tell him? That sleep felt like a betrayal of the nascent understanding blooming in my mind. That his worries about human comforts were utterly meaningless in the face of what I now knew. The detachment was unnerving, even to me. I found myself observing my own physical reactions, a curious bystander to the degradation of my own form. The faint ache in my joints, the dryness of my mouth, the incessant buzz behind my eyeballs, they were just data points, distractions from the true, important work. My hands, once precise and steady, now shook with a fine tremor. But they still navigated the complex interfaces with an almost instinctive grace, guided by something beyond mere muscle memory. It started subtly, like a trick of the light. A ripple in the air above my console, a fleeting shimmer that made the robust metal housing seem to flex, just for an instant. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and it was gone. The fluorescent hum of the bass, usually a steady drone, seemed to fluctuate, dipping into a lower, guttural thrum before snapping back to its regular pitch. I dismissed it. Fatigue, I told myself, the strain of staring at screens for 18 hours straight. The next day, while retrieving a thermal flask from the common area, the ceramic mug in my hand seemed to elongate, its rim stretching into an impassable oval before snapping back into a perfect circle. My grip tightened, my grip tight. The hot coffee sloshed over my fingers, but I barely registered the burn. Was the base itself shifting, or was it something else entirely? The distortions intensified. The polished floor tiles in the corridor sometimes appeared to breathe, their gray surfaces rippling like disturbed water. The sharp edges of the doorways would soften, blurring into curves that defied geometry, then reform with a jarring snap. I learned not to point them out. The one time I'd mentioned a peculiar shimmer in the air to a junior technician, he just stared at me, then quickly excused himself. Their reality, I realized, was still intact, still comfortably finite. Mine was not. The knowledge wasn't a set of equations or a new theory. It was an impression, a deep-seated knowing that seeped into my bones, a recalibration of my very perception. The universe wasn't just bigger than we thought. It was different. Fundamentally, terrifyingly different. And the signal, this impassably ancient presence, was merely a ripple from beyond the edges of human comprehension, a whisper in the dark that carried the weight of truly elder truths. It implied structures, entities, and states of being that made the vastness of space seem like a mere speck of dust on an infinite tapestry. I was in my lab, the air thick with the smell of ozone and stale coffee, when the chief engineer approached. He was a sturdy man, his face usually jovial. Now his brow was furrowed with concern. "Raj," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "the supply drop is due in 2 weeks. We need your input on the long-range weather projections. Your models are the most accurate." I turned, my movement stiff, as if my joints were packed with sand. His face, usually so familiar, seemed to waver, not a blur but a subtle undulation, as if his features were momentarily liquid, the lines of his mouth and nose subtly shifting, only to settle back into place. My gaze must have been unsettling, because he took a half-step back. "Raj," he repeated, a tremor in his voice. "Weather," I said, the word feeling clumsy on my tongue. "It is irrelevant. The patterns, they are temporary." My voice was raspy, unused. I hadn't spoken more than a few clipped sentences in days. "There are greater patterns at play." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. "Greater patterns, Raj. We need to know if the storm front will delay the transport plane. People are counting on those supplies." His words, once urgent, now sounded distant, like buzzing flies. People, what were people in the grand scheme? Fleeting blips of consciousness on a tiny, fragile world, entirely unaware of the true architecture of existence. "The storm will pass," I stated, not with certainty, but with an odd, detached finality. "Or it will not. Either way, it is a minor fluctuation." I turned back to my screen, the luminous data drawing me in, the engineer's presence already fading from my mind. The faint, almost imperceptible hum that sometimes emanated from the data itself was more real than his worried gaze. He left without another word, his footsteps heavy, retreating down the corridor. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. My heart began to beat a ragged rhythm against my ribs, a dull thudding that seemed to echo the strange, deep resonance that now filled the room. I didn't close my eyes. I couldn't. The distortions were no longer fleeting. The very fabric of the wall opposite me seemed to ripple, the metal panels flexing inward, then outward, as if breathing. What was I truly seeing? The universe stripped bare, or merely the unraveling of my own mind? The colleague's voice, once a persistent drone, had faded to a whisper even before he left my small lab. "Storm front, supplies, people." The words were hollow, like pebbles rattling in an empty tin. My gaze was fixed on the screen, a canvas of shifting patterns that dwarfed any concern for the transient needs of flesh and bone. The signal. It was always the signal. I had spent weeks, months, charting its intricacies, dissecting its layers, convinced it was a data stream of unimaginable complexity. It wasn't just information. It wasn't just a record. It was active. I leaned closer to the primary monitor, my breath fogging the cool glass. The intricate glyphs, once perceived as static, now seemed to undulate, to breathe. There was a rhythm to their morphing, a pulse that resonated not in my ears, but somewhere deeper behind my eyes. I felt a subtle, almost imperceptible tug. It wasn't an auditory phenomenon, nor a visual trick. It was a sensation, a directional pull, like a faint magnetic field drawing a compass needle. The signal wasn't merely present, it was reaching. It was a beckoning. This wasn't an observation, it was an invitation. and invitations I knew demanded a response. The colleague had left the door ajar, a sliver of yellow light from the main corridor spilling onto the polished floor, but those sounds felt distant, unreal. My reality was here, in the shimmering, silent language on the screen. I ran a hand through my hair, the bristles standing on end, charged with an unspoken tension. Amplification. I needed to bridge the gap. I needed to feel the full current of that beckoning, to let it flow directly into me unobstructed. The standard receivers, the filters, the interpretive algorithms, they were all barriers, noise reduction in a symphony I needed to experience raw. My eyes scanned the makeshift shelves, littered with discarded prototypes, spare parts, and obsolete equipment. A tangle of wires, old electrode pads, a battered signal processor from a previous expedition. I pulled them down, a clatter echoing in the quiet lab. The dust motes danced in the pale overhead light. My hands, usually precise, moved with a frantic, almost desperate energy. This wouldn't be about decoding, it would be about immersion. I began to strip insulation from wires, the scent of burnt rubber and old plastic filling the confined space. I bypassed the main processing unit, creating a direct conduit from the antenna array to a modified biofeedback interface I had once used for neural mapping experiments. It was a crude, dangerous alteration, twisting the purpose of each component. The colleague, with his talk of storm fronts and supplies, would have called it madness. I called it necessary. I soldered connections, the tiny plume of smoke curling upwards, stinging my eyes. My breath hitched. The air in the lab grew heavy, charged with the ozone smell of overworked electronics. This wasn't science in the conventional sense. I connected the electrode pads to the modified interface, a crude mesh of copper and silver. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I positioned them against my temples. A faint prickle, like static electricity, spread across my skin. I felt a pulse begin to quicken in my neck. The air grew thick around me, almost viscous. My gaze fell upon the screen again. The patterns pulsed, grew brighter, seemed to lean forward, awaiting my readiness. Was this truly a path to understanding, or merely a surrender to the inevitable? What would flow through that direct current once the last barrier was removed? Storm front, supplies. My gaze was fixed on the screen, a canvas of shifting patterns that dwarfed any concern for the transient concerns of the base. The signal, it had changed. It pulsed now, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated not just the equipment, but the very air in the small, insulated room. I felt it in my teeth, a low, resonant frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to the bone. My fingers, still trembling from the last surge, hovered over the console. I had amplified the receiver, pushed the filters to their absolute limit, stripped away every layer of cosmic noise. What remained was raw, unfiltered. It was a direct line. My skin felt too tight, stretched over a skull suddenly too small. The air grew heavy, like breathing through wet wool. I pressed the final sequence, a series of commands I designed to open the floodgates, to let whatever was on the other side in. The screen flared, a blinding white that made the room's emergency lights dim in comparison. Then it resolved. Not an image, not a waveform, it was a language, but one without sound, without symbols. It was pure information, a torrential downpour of data that bypassed my optic nerves, my auditory canals, and plunged directly into the deepest parts of my mind. My head throbbed, a dull ache that quickly sharpened into a piercing pressure, as if my skull were a fragile shell trying to contain an ocean. The hum from the equipment had vanished. The world had gone quiet, save for the frantic beat of my own heart. What I perceived was not a form in the way I understood it. There were no dimensions, no spatial coordinates. It was an architecture of thought, an infinitely complex lattice woven from concepts that had no human equivalents. Imagine seeing not a tree, but the fundamental idea of growth, of cellulose, of light absorption all at once, without the intermediary of visual representation. That was what flooded my awareness. It was vast, unimaginably, terrifyingly vast. My mind buckled under the weight of it, a frail vessel tossed by an impossible tide. I saw, or rather, understood, that what I had been tracking was not a single entity, but an overarching intelligence. It was not a being in the traditional sense, but a fundamental principle, a cosmic architect. It was not alive, yet it was. It was not conscious, yet it knew. It was everything that was and everything that would be, a slow, deliberate unfolding of existence itself. And I, Raj, a man in a cold metal box at the bottom of the world, was merely a fleeting spark in its boundless, indifferent awareness. My breath hitched, my hands clenched into fists, fingernails biting into my palms, but I felt nothing. All sensation had receded, replaced by this overwhelming, alien comprehension. The walls of my lab seemed to ripple, the rigid lines of the console blurring, softening. Not a physical change, I knew, but a distortion in my own perception. A fracturing of the reality I had always taken for granted. Its purpose, then, that was the crushing blow. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't even aware of us in any meaningful way. It was simply reshaping, a slow, inevitable process, like the erosion of mountains by wind and rain, but on a cosmic scale. Our galaxies, our stars, our planets, our lives, we were merely incidental dust motes in its grand, unfolding design. A temporary configuration of matter, soon to be swept aside, absorbed, repatterned. The universe wasn't a stage for life, but a canvas for this profound, indifferent entity, slowly, meticulously altering its own fabric. The very meaning of my existence, of all human striving, all our triumphs and tragedies, was reduced to less than a cosmic speck. We were not even a thought in its vast alien mind. We were a temporary pattern on its skin, soon to be shed. My eyes burned, tears pricking at the corners. But they wouldn't fall. The pressure in my head intensified, a silent scream building behind my eyes. I wanted to recoil, to shut it out, but the connection was too deep, too absolute. I was immersed, drowning in a sea of pure cosmic truth. And if it was reshaping reality, what would be left when it was done? My gaze remained fixed on the screen, a tapestry of shifting patterns that dwarfed any concern for the transient concerns of the world outside my small lab. The colleague's voice, once a persistent drone, had faded to a whisper even before he left. Storm front, supplies, then the static began, not the usual white noise hiss that occasionally marred the data stream, but something deeper, a pervasive fuzz that seemed to cling to the edges of my vision, a shimmer in the air itself. I blinked, rubbing at my eyes, convinced it was strain from the ceaseless hours staring into the glowing monitor. But the shimmer persisted, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the very fabric of the lab's air, as if the molecules themselves were vibrating to an unheard frequency. I ran a hand through my thinning hair, a strange, prickling sensation crawling across my scalp. The next morning, the cook, a man whose routine was as predictable as the sun's absent arc, poured my coffee with a hand that shook. He didn't apologize, didn't even seem to notice. His eyes, usually bright with a gruff cheer, were wide and unfocused, fixed on something beyond the frost-rimmed window. "The sky," he murmured, his voice raspy. "It's different." I glanced out. The perpetual twilight of the Antarctic winter, always a muted palette of grays and blues, seemed to have taken on a new, unsettling hue. A faint, bruised purple bled into the distant horizon, a color I'd never seen before, not even in the most spectacular auroras. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a bruise forming on the world's skin. What was it he truly saw out there beyond the glass? The shifts weren't just visual. The hum of the base's generators, a constant, reassuring thrum, began to waver, dipping and surging in an irregular rhythm that set my teeth on edge. Doors would creak open on their own, not from drafts, but with a slow, deliberate groan, as if a great, unseen weight was pressing against them. My colleagues, too, were changing. They'd stare at walls, at their hands, at nothing at all, their expressions vacant. The easy camaraderie that had once bound us in this desolate outpost began to fray, replaced by a pervasive unease that settled like dust on every surface. Was it the isolation, or something far more insidious, seeping into their minds? I started noticing the patterns, the way the strange atmospheric phenomena seemed to mirror the fluctuations in the signal I was receiving. A spike in the entity's output on my screen would coincide with a sudden, violent shudder of the base, a deep tremor that rattled the very foundations. The purple bruise in the sky would deepen, bleeding into a sickly ochre, and then, a few hours later, the signal would subside, leaving behind only the faint, shimmering residue in the air. It was as if I was watching the entity breathe, its exhalations manifesting as these inexplicable distortions in our reality. My own thoughts felt less like my own, increasingly interspersed with strange, disjointed images, vast, empty spaces, shapes that defied geometry, a sense of crushing, indifferent age. I was no longer merely observing, I was connected, a raw nerve ending for something vast and terrible. Was I a recipient, or had I become a part of its transmission? The isolation, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The colleague who usually brought me stale biscuits and lukewarm tea stopped coming. His eyes were wide, wet, and he was muttering to himself, a low, continuous drone of words I couldn't quite decipher. When he saw me, his face twisted, not in recognition, but in something akin to revulsion, as if I were a ghost, or worse, a harbinger. He veered away, stumbling into a storage room and slamming the door shut. I heard the muffled thud of his body hitting the wall. It was no longer just my perception twisting. The veil, it seemed, was thinning for everyone. What would happen when it finally tore completely? Storm front, supplies, people. The words were hollow, distant echoes, irrelevant against the vibrant, pulsating geometry now blooming before me. The patterns on the display, once abstract, began to suggest form. Not shapes I recognized, but a kind of implied architecture, lines that bent and converged in ways that spoke of dimensions beyond my grasp. My eyes ached, straining to reconcile what I saw with what I knew. The screen wasn't just showing data anymore. It felt like a window, and something was pressing against the glass from the other side. I pushed back from my console, the chair scraping against the floor. The sound was too loud, too sharp, like a shard of glass against a ceramic plate. My breath hitched. The lab door, a standard reinforced steel panel, looked different. The edges weren't quite parallel. The top seemed to angle inward subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to snag my vision, to make my mind recoil from the impossible geometry. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. It resolved, then wavered again like heat haze over asphalt. My heart gave a stuttering thump. No, it was just fatigue. The endless hours, the signal, the isolation. My determination, however, would not waver. I stood, needing to move, to confirm the solidity of the world. The corridor outside the lab was usually a straight, utilitarian tunnel of gray steel and white lighting. Now, as I stepped out, it felt wrong, longer. I walked, my boots sounding heavier than usual on the gridded floor. The air, typically sterile and recycled, carried a faint, coppery tang, like old blood mixed with ozone. It was a smell I hadn't noticed before, and once I did, it clung to the back of my throat. I saw a colleague, a logistics officer, at the far end of the corridor, fumbling with a supply crate. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. He dropped a tool, then simply stared at it on the floor, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, as if listening to a sound I couldn't hear. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice sounding thin, alien in the strange stillness. He didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted past me, unfocused, then slowly, agonizingly settled on my face. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and held a profound, unsettling emptiness. They don't add up anymore, the crates. They are, fewer more, I can't. He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the stack of identical crates, his hand trembling. My own stomach tightened. He wasn't just tired. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. The inventory, the days, the light. It's not right, it's always shifting. He looked down at the crate he'd been trying to open, then back up at me, a flicker of something close to recognition, then pure, unadulterated panic. "It's all wet." I looked at the crate. It was dry, dusty from storage. Nothing was wet, yet he flinched back from it as if scalded, stumbling away down the corridor, his boots dragging. He didn't run, but rather retreated with a strange, lurching gait, disappearing around a corner that now seemed to twist sharply, impossibly, into the gloom. The metallic tang in the air intensified, catching in my throat, making my eyes water. I felt a pressure building behind my temples, a faint hum that wasn't from the base's machinery. It was inside my head. The walls of the corridor seemed to breathe, subtly expanding and contracting, the metal plates groaning as if under immense, unseen stress. Present. I backed away, retreating to the relative sanctuary of my lab. I had to understand this. The signal, it was doing this. It was here. It wasn't just a pattern on a screen. It was an influence, a slow poison seeping into the very fabric of our shared world. The impossible geometries I'd seen, the bending of natural laws, the unraveling consciousness of my colleague, it was all connected. And I, with my insatiable need to know, had pulled the thread. Back at my console, the screen pulsed with renewed intensity. The patterns now seemed to swirl, to vortex, drawing my gaze deeper. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the glass. I could feel a faint vibration, a resonance. This was no longer just information. It was an invitation, a doorway. Then, the lights in the lab flickered violently, not just a momentary stutter, but a rapid, chaotic strobe. When they stabilized, the lab was subtly changed. The corner where the server rack stood seemed to curve inwards, forming a gentle, concave depression where a sharp angle should have been. The floor beneath my feet felt as if it sloped gently towards that impassable curve, even though my balance told me it was flat. And the air was thick, heavy, pressing down on me. I tasted salt, then something else, something metallic and vast, like the breath of an ocean that had never known a shore. A low, resonant thrum vibrated through the floor, a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to my bones. It deepened, becoming a sustained tone that felt like a question, an endless, patient query. The screen pulsed, reflecting my own wide, horrified eyes. Had I brought this upon us, and what would it ask of me next? The logistics manager was gone. The clatter of his boots faded, swallowed by the vast, metal silence of the underground bunker. I stood alone before the crate, its rough-hewn planks casting long, distorted shadows under the emergency lights. My skin prickled. This was deeper, an internal frost that radiated from my core, a strange warmth coiling within it. My vision felt sharper. The dust motes dancing in the limited light didn't just float. They seemed to trace intricate, invisible currents, revealing patterns I'd never perceived before. The signal. It wasn't just data anymore, not a series of incomprehensible pulses. It was a language, a presence, and it was speaking to me, not just through my instruments. The crate, I realized, was merely an amplifier, a physical focus for something that had no need for such crude vessels. A hum began in my teeth, vibrating through my jaw down my spine. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was a sound I felt with every cell, a resonance that was both profoundly painful and terribly familiar. My muscles tensed, then relaxed in a way that felt alien, as if they were being restrung, prepared for a new kind of movement. I raised a hand, turning it over. The lines on my palm seemed to deepen, to shift, forming constellations of minute ridges that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence only I could perceive. My fingers, when I flexed them, felt stretched, elongated. The skin seemed thinner, translucent, revealing not bone and muscle, but a faint, pulsing lattice of light, or something that mimicked light, a geometry that defied anatomy. The hum intensified, coalescing into a single, sustained tone that filled the bunker, though no one else would hear it. It was the universe's own song, distorted through the filter of my dissolving humanity. Concepts I'd spent a lifetime trying to grasp were no longer concepts. They were truths, self-evident and horrifying in their simplicity. It was teeming. I walked towards the crate, my steps light, almost buoyant. The air around the crate shimmered, not with heat, but with a distortion of light, a visible warping of reality. I reached out a hand, no longer feeling the rough wood, but an energy raw and ancient thrumming against my palm. It wasn't hostile. It was indifferent, like a mountain or the ocean or the slow, inexorable turning of a galaxy, and I was becoming a part of it. My vision blurred again, then sharpened in a way I couldn't comprehend. They were apertures, openings into spaces that defied three dimensions, glimpses of impossible angles and non-Euclidean geometries. I saw the true forms of things, the underlying structures that held reality together, and the terrible, vast emptiness between them. My eyes, I knew, were no longer seeing as human eyes. They were instruments, calibrated to a new spectrum of existence. It was the signal, the presence, the elder truth, finally making itself known without the veil of data or equations. It spoke of slumbering titans, of cosmic architects who built the scaffolding of existence and then retreated, leaving behind echoes of their dreams. It spoke of a universe that was not dead, but merely sleeping, and now through me, it was beginning to stir. My internal organs felt as if they were rearranging themselves, not painfully, but with a sense of purpose, aligning to a new, incomprehensible blueprint. My pulse throbbed not with blood, but with the rhythm of distant, colossal heartbeats. I was no longer a man made of flesh and bone, but a vessel, a conduit, an antenna tuned to the true frequencies of the cosmos. The Raj I knew, the astrophysicist, the seeker of truth, was gone. He was merely the chrysalis from which this new thing emerged. I pressed my hands flat against the rough wood of the crate, and a faint, resonant hum emanated from it, passing into me, through me, and out into the vast, lightless expanse of the underground bunker. The world, the universe, was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a truth to be inhabited, and I was inhabiting it, What would I do now? What could I do? The questions felt like echoes from a life I no longer inhabited. The answers, if they existed, were no longer for human ears. I only knew that I was hungry, not for food, but for information, for the infinite. Terrible knowledge that now pulsed within me. What would I become in this new, terrible dawn? The air, usually a stale mix of ozone and recycled breath, now felt different. It was heavy, like a dense, unseen current pressing against my eardrums. A subtle vibration, too low to be a sound, hummed through the concrete floor, rising through the soles of my boots and into my bones. The logistics manager was gone, his absence a vast, echoing cavity in the already immense underground bunker. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the coarse grain of the wood. The crate wasn't sealed with nails or screws, but with thick, tarnished brass clasps. They were ancient, scored with symbols that looked less like human script and more like the frantic etchings of something trying to claw its way out of stone. A metallic scent, sharp and cold, like frozen iron, drifted from the seams. It mixed with something else, something cloying and sweet, reminiscent of ozone after a lightning strike, but deeper, more fundamental. I unlatched the clasps one by one. Each click echoed with unnerving clarity in the vast space, sounding less like metal on metal and more like bone snapping. The lid, heavy and reluctant, lifted with a groan of stressed wood. No light spilled out, no sudden flash of the impossible. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like solidified ash, was not an object I could readily identify. It wasn't metal, nor stone, nor any organic material I had ever encountered. It was a formless mass, vaguely ovoid, shimmering with an internal, impossible light that shifted colors without ever illuminating its surroundings. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that resonated with the forgotten signal I had chased across the cosmos. It was silent, yet I could feel it. A pressure behind my eyes, a low thrumming in my teeth. It wasn't just emitting the signal, it was the signal, solidified into something tangible and horrifying. What did I hold, or rather, what was holding me? I reached out, my hand moving without my conscious command. The surface of the mass was cool, like polished ice, yet yielded slightly under my touch, like firm flesh. It didn't feel solid, it felt permeable. As my fingers pressed against it, the internal light intensified, not brightening the bunker, but deepening the impossible colors within the object itself. They were hues I had no name for, colors that vibrated on the edge of my perception, promising depths of vision I wasn't meant to access. It wasn't a language. It was a vast, ancient hunger, a patient, all-encompassing awareness that had been dormant for eons, now stirring. The bunker walls began to ripple, not physically, but visually, as if the concrete was suddenly liquid, flowing in slow, heavy currents. The emergency lights flickered, not failing but changing color, shifting from stark white to a sickly, pulsing violet, then to a deep, bruised indigo. I could feel the Antarctic ice sheet above us, the crushing weight of it, but also something else, something far vaster, reaching down from the black sky above the research base. It felt like the entire world was exhaling, a long, drawn-out sigh that carried the scent of frozen dust and unimaginable distance. Was this what the signal had always wanted me to see? My body felt disconnected. My legs were heavy, rooted to the spot, while my head swam in a sea of impossible sensations. The faint thrumming in my teeth became a grinding pressure, as if my molars were turning to grit. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the very air around me distorting. The entity wasn't just present, it was, here, manifesting itself by unraveling the fabric of everything familiar. What was happening to the world? The air itself solidified, becoming a viscous medium that pressed against my skin, muffling sound, distorting light. The floor of the bunker groaned, not with structural stress, but with a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the planet. I was no longer in a man-made structure beneath the ice. I was in a vast, echoing chamber, carved from something ancient and alien, a space that stretched into impossible dimensions. My own sanity, a fragile construct, began to fray at the edges, dissolving into the overwhelming presence. Was this what understanding felt like? I looked down at my hands. They were no longer mine. The skin was mottled with the shifting, impossible colors of the object in the crate. My fingers seemed elongated, translucent, shimmering faintly with an inner light. The world was not merely alien, it was the alien. The entity was not merely observing. It was experiencing through me, through the transformed bunker, through the very air. The signal wasn't just a communication, it was a transformation, a fundamental reshaping of existence. The truth was not something to be understood, but something to be endured. A profound, crushing insignificance washed over me, not a feeling of despair, but of complete, utter absorption. What was left of Raj?